think we're officially broadcasting. Now I'm pushing the live tweet out to say that we're going live. All right. Switching to show notes. Thanks for joining us once again. I'm Sammy K. Powers, and this is the PHP Roundtable. This is a live podcast of developers discussing topics that PHP nerds care about. The ultimate goal of this podcast is to learn a little something from each other. If you're listening live and want to be a part of the conversation, send a tweet to PHP Roundtable with a question, and we'll try to get your question answered if we can. You may have noticed by now that we have two interpreters in this episode interpreting everything I'm saying into sign language. That's because we're discussing a really important but often overlooked aspect of web development, and that is accessibility. Joining us at the roundtable today are two web developers who are deaf, and we're going to learn from them a little bit about deaf culture and what it's like to browse the web as a deaf person. And we also have two web accessibility nerds joining us to give us some great Accessibility 101 tech tips to help us get started in making our own web projects more accessible. Finally, we'll look at how governments get involved in regulating certain websites for their accessibility. And normally I'd go around and introduce everyone at the roundtable, but in this episode, which I have, somebody's making a little bit of noise in the background, so I'm not really sure who that is. Sorry guys, I'm going to just have to mute a couple people here. Wait, it's not you guys. Oh, maybe it's on the interpreter side. Let me double check. Yeah, it's the interpreters. It's all good. When the interpreters speak, you guys should have hopefully access to unmute yourself. If not, I will try to do that for you. But normally I would go around and introduce everyone at the round table, but in this episode we're going to have each guest introduce themselves so that our interpreters can more easily interpret for them. So, in no particular order, let's start off with Chris.
Hello, my name is Chris Walker, and I work at Northwestern University as a web applications developer. And we work in the Student Affairs Division, and in our division we have the Disability Services Department. And so it's been the last, say, 3 or 4 years that I've really started working closely with that department to learn about what are some of the accessibility issues, especially for our web presence. And then to take what I've learned and present that to other developers on campus and also at other universities. So I'm really excited to, talk with other developers about best practices to make the web more accessible.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much for coming on, Chris.
Thank you.
And we'll switch over to Hao. What's up, Hao?
Hey, so my name is Hao. I work at Northwestern as a web developer. I work closely with Chris. And I got into web development or web accessibility about 2 years ago, so not very long. But I find web accessibility a topic that's very, very interesting, and there's always something new to learn. And I do a lot of outreach and presentations with Chris here at Northwestern.
Cool. Well, thank you for coming on as well.
Sure.
I'm going to kick it over to Jason. Hi, Jason.
Sorry, the interpreters were on mute. Okay. Hi, my name is Jason. I'm a front-end developer at an organization called Jellyvision. I'm really excited about being here today. So it's kind of neat being on this open panel on the PHP Roundtable. So thank you.
Well, thanks for joining us, Jason. Really appreciate you taking the time to join us. And finally, let's kick it over to Andy. Would you like to introduce yourself, Andy?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for inviting me to the PHP Roundtable today. My name is Andy. My last name is Warwick. I am deaf myself. I grew up deaf. I had hearing aids growing up. Oh my gosh, I've been in web development, I don't know how many years. And recently, I graduated from RIT. No, I'm very glad to be here to discuss different things like programming. I'm a LAMP stack developer. I do a bunch of different things. So, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, PHP, Ruby. Also I've worked on the Laravel framework.
And I'm heavily involved with deaf culture as well.
Excellent. Well,
Videos.
thank you so much for joining. All right, we're going to start off with a little bit of kind of a discovery of culture, and I wanted to look a bit more into the deaf community and what that's all about, and I wanted to start with Andy. Andy, what is it like in the day of the life of a person who's deaf?
Well, it's really hard to say because there's a lot of diversity within the deaf community. You have people that can and can't read speech. I can read lips pretty well, but it depends on who you're asking. Some people have a really hard time with speech reading when they go out to a restaurant or something and ordering food. I tend to go ahead and just speak. Other folks, they just use pen and paper. That's just the easiest way to go in that situation. Some folks have some residual hearing, some folks can't. I grew up with hearing aids, so I can kind of move around in the hearing world. I notice when my mom screams my name. Now I don't have my hearing aids in, so now the world's just quiet to me. I kind of know how to go about things, and I get the general sense of it, but I just prefer it that way. In my work, I communicate with people in 3 ways. There's IM, there's email, and there's VRS, video relay services. So I'll call a hearing client, and we go through a centralized relay person. That person, basically they speak everything that I sign, and when my client voices, then they will sign for me. I'm sorry, interpreter clarification. The video is a little bit choppy. Do I repeat? Video a little bit choppy. Do I repeat one more? Oh, I don't know where I was going to continue with that. But going back. We're talking about some people can lip read, some people can't. Yeah, finish that. Kind of feel just at ease with everything that's happening with me, and it's kind of strange to not really have any, to basically not be hearing, but I move along in the world.
Cool. So before the show, I was asking about how I could be more sensitive about the way I spoke about the deaf community, and something you mentioned was not to refer to it as hearing impaired. Can you expand on that a bit?
Yeah, I do have a problem with that word, hearing impaired. Deaf itself, it means that, there's nothing broken with me. It's not that. Deafness means it's an identity. It's not some kind of medical condition that I need to worry about. It's not a medical problem. It's my identity. It involves language. It involves culture. It has those deaf values that really are central to the deaf world. We have a set of standards and norms that we really cherish, and those 3 things, they really are closely connected to what I feel deafness is. And in the deaf world, it's really connected to vision, and it's really connected. vision is extremely important within the deaf world.
And deaf people can catch things visually a lot faster than hearing people can.
You know, it's not really a different way to live. It's just a kind of a different perception.
True, and it's really cool. I like this. I like how the deaf community is very proud of being deaf, and it's just something that that I think is really cool. But I had a little question for you, Andy. Have you, just out of curiosity, has the headmaster from the New York School for the Hard of Hearing, Garrett Morris, ever interpreted for you?
I'm sorry, could you say the name of the school again?
Garrett.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the headmaster from the New York School of the Hard of Hearing, Garrett Morris.
Oh, I remember way back when. Yeah, it was like or something. Just we would just shout. Yeah. I really don't have any stories connected to that, unfortunately.
Yeah, it was just a joke. Yeah, so sorry, I'm actually acting as host and cameraman, so I'm trying to make sure that when I click on whoever's signing in Google Hangout, so that the viewers outside can see whoever's signing, and that way we can make this episode as accessible as possible. So, Andy, I have a few more questions for you. When you're browsing the web, what issues do you typically run into that hearing people probably wouldn't even think about?
For example, you know, when I go to CNN, you know, I'll go to CNN for a news site and see a news story there, and I arrive there, and I get frustrated. You know, before, but now things are starting to improve there. You know, sometimes there might be, you know, there might be there. For example, another one is YouTube. You know, there's so many videos there, a lot of great quality stuff there, but you know, it's you know, the automatic captions, for example, like they're really trying, but a lot of times the word choices there are just really poor and it misses the topic. On Netflix, you know, that's Netflix captioning on Netflix has vastly been improving, but you know, sometimes still it's a little bit off. Sometimes the timing of captions could be completely forward or backwards or just completely off. So you know, you really miss what's in the story if the captions aren't timed right. You know, and if I'm trying to research something for programming, I'll search on Google, and if I need help learning how to do a certain thing, I'll look at some of the results, and sometimes, you know, a tutorial will pop up. And again, you know, can I use that? I can see it, but there's just a lot of talking, but no captions. So for me, that's no good. You know, so I really miss that educational opportunity. So, and it was just a big waste of time for me. So I guess that's the big thing.
Well, you mentioned before the show that there are human factors that sometimes interfere with accessibility, despite what available accessibility technology exists. So, what have your experiences been when you're with having that human factor interfere with accessibility?
I have two examples of that, really, that happened to me. It was a while back. I made a call to video relay services, and it was possible. Like, we were talking about this gentleman's project, and on VRS came up, and we were just chatting. We were discussing the project, and then after that, he emailed me and he said, "If do you mind signing a non-disclosure agreement?" And I said, "Yeah, sure. That's not a problem." But that meant we can't use VRS because he was really misinformed about that because he was worried about our information going through a central party. So, and that really had me stuck. And the other one was that, in another job, I set up a chat client. I set up a chat client in our office. That way everyone could communicate around. It was kind of like an inner office IM. and people could chat with me, so therefore we can communicate. But the manager was, he didn't want to force people to use yet another program. So, I guess how would I work with that? So I said, oh, okay. He said that I needed to meet with people face to face, but I was stuck. Like, it was really hard. So those two things really had me stuck. The technology is available, it's there, but it's the human factor that really kind of prevented that stuff from really working. So those were two things that happened.
Right. So hopefully by the end of this episode, we'll have at least covered the idea of adding accessibility to the web, and those issues or those stigmas will kind of be broken down a little bit with people that are watching or following along with this episode. So that would be a really great thing to come out of this. So, but actually, I want to kick it over to Jason, who in the dry run, he had a dry run for this, just to make sure we could work out all the technical details. But he mentioned something about the modern social networking, like the way that we do social networking on Facebook and Twitter, and how that's really changed the landscape of how people from the deaf community interact with the hearing community. Jason, can you talk a bit more about that idea?
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. Oh, so say, for example, say like 10 years ago, there was really no, there was kind of a division between hearing and deaf community. There was, deaf people would get together, chat, socialize. Hearing people can talk on the phone. So, I'm sorry, and deaf people, it's kind of the same thing. They would meet, socialize in the community, basically different cultural events, schools. You had a place that each can communicate. But now it's interesting because now those two groups can communicate with each other. Deaf, hearing, doesn't matter. It really, like myself, I'm deaf blind. It doesn't. It's become very interesting in how people become more sensitive to each other, and they can get in touch with each other.
So do you feel like it's a lot better than it used to be now that we interact through Facebook, or does it make it awkward when you're interacting with a hearing person who doesn't actually realize that they're talking with somebody who's deaf, and maybe later on when you're trying to do other interactions, does that make it weird, or is it still all good? Like, is it a good thing?
I would hope that it would continually improve. I'm hopeful because now it's not declining. I think it's really improving. It's an opportunity to really improve. It's an opportunity to improve work. It's an opportunity to improve networking abilities, to make connections. Friends and family, husband, wives, whatever. It's just, I'm really surprised at the time now.
Cool. So you were discussing before the show also that deaf people miss a lot of hearing opportunities, such as meetup, like when there's a meetup or a networking event or webinar, due to having a lack of having like an interpreter. So what were your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's always a tough situation because an interpreter. You can't get an interpreter for free. That's just the nature of the world. Like, for example, take a meetup or something like that, or it's a benefit to be able to go there, but they have limited funds, so it's, a deaf person just can't show up there. It's kind of limiting. It's a limited opportunity if you're deaf. If you're a deaf programmer, it's, or using meetups or whatever, it's often you miss 100% of the information. So, it's like you can see the stuff on the slides, you can see, yes, but the philosophy itself, like how do you miss a lot of points. You miss a lot by not having an interpreter. So yeah, it's just by not having an interpreter, you miss a lot.
Well, I'm going to switch gears to actually browsing the web. What would you say are some pet peeves that you run into when you're browsing something that isn't quite accessible? What are some things that you commonly run into?
Yes, well, I know of a few, and I'm also trying. I also have a limited visual field, so I see it from both. So a lot of that information will overwhelm me on the web because there's pictures all over the place, and there's too much, and it's easy to get really distracted. And
oh, so for font size.
And the typography or the font sizes, a lot of them, they might look pretty, but it's really hard to read still. So, when there are color issues or the color contrast doesn't agree with the background, sometimes I have to zoom in and bring the text a little bit closer so I can see it, even though I'm right in front of it. But it's still a bother. So, and as well, the captions will be. I wish more videos would be captioned. So, that's really just some of the things that make me crazy.
That's understandable. Well, so in those situations, what aids and tools do you actually use to help you browse the web and make it a better experience for yourself?
Often I will use Chrome, the developer tools within Chrome, and
hack the CSS. And I'll hack the CSS to try to convert things to, make it, to really augment the colors, to make them more clear to me, and to change the font size. So I start eliminating things, honestly, in the Chrome developer tools. I'll just eliminate things that are in my way.
Like a true web developer would, right?
Yes.
Awesome. Well, I want to switch gears a little bit and just start talking to Hao and Chris about some of the tech tips that we as web developers could start implementing. But before we do that, Hao, why is accessibility so important? Why should we web developers even care about web accessibility?
So the short answer is it's the right thing to do, right? In the kind of the foundational level, like the web is built on the idea of openness and having equal access to information. So when you build something, you want to include everybody. You want everybody to get to the information that you're trying to present, right? But like you said, Sammy, in the beginning, that web accessibility is something that's often overlooked by web developers. And I think that's because web accessibility, for the most part, it's invisible, right? When we develop a web page, we often just code the HTML and the CSS and then look at the web browser, and we're like, oh, that looks good. And then hover over the links, like, oh, it has hover state, that looks good. But we don't really, then test it with keyboard, right? Or open up this screen reader, which we'll get into later. But when we go to another site and we get lazy or our mouse is not near us, we try to access the web page with our keyboard. And if it works, it works. If it doesn't, then it's fine with us. But for some people, using a mouse is not possible, right? So I think just us to be aware of web accessibility is very important. And then the next step obviously is to know how to make our page accessible.
Right. Well, as an added kind of bonus to that, as I was doing some research for the show notes, I saw this really cool video by David Berman. And in the video, he makes this cool point about that the biggest visitor to our site has very, very limited abilities. And this visitor can't see or hear and needs tons of accessibility features, and that visitor is like a Google bot, right? So would you say that making your site more accessible will pretty much automatically make your website even more search engine compatible and improve your search engine rankings? Have you seen that?
I don't know if it like automatically improves your search rankings, but if you build your page with accessibility in mind, then you're kind of forced to make your site or your page more structured, and you would use the right HTML headings. And what I often say to people is that web accessibility makes developers sane, or keeps us sane. Because we are encouraged to use some of the best practices when we make our web pages, so that when we go back to it 6 months from now, we're not like, oh, what were we doing with this heading again? Like, are we using some crazy like HTML CSS hack to make it work? We know that we're using the best practices.
And on that point, on a typical web project, with your work at the university, do you typically get a project that's already built out and then it's like, okay, make this web accessible, or do you get the opportunity to start from the ground up with accessibility in mind?
So Chris and I were pretty lucky to work in a small team, and we do have a separate marketing team that works with us, but they're also very small. So we kind of have the opportunity and the ability to work together. So we recently just gone through a website redesign, and web accessibility is something that was brought up from the very beginning. So in the ideal world, every project, accessibility is like on the top of the priority list, but that's not the reality, right? A lot of times we have to take our audience into consideration, or we have to take our deadline into consideration. If your audience is just staff, for example, like in the university context, then like everybody can see, then maybe we can say, okay, we don't have to like stress test this application with a screen reader or every type of screen reader out there.
Right. Well, that's so you actually tag team with Chris, right? At the university, making things accessible.
Yes.
So Chris, what are some of the disabilities that you guys take into consideration, and like how do you talk about them at work?
Well, the one I know more about is visitors to our websites or web applications that have either low vision or no vision. And quite honestly, that probably takes the majority of our time when we're making our pages accessible. To think about how these web applications work with screen readers, how it might work with Zoom text, it takes a lot of time. But luckily, I've been fortunate to work with some students who have vision disabilities, and it's I've learned a lot from them. Much more than I would have than just scouring the web for best practices. To actually do some usability testing has really educated me to better accessibility. So there's vision is probably the #1 thing that I'm considering when I'm doing markup. But as we know, obviously there's things about hard of hearing, deafness. How can we put captions, and what other differences between captions and video descriptions and subtitles. There's a lot for me to learn and other developers in that issue. But there's also things like cognitive disabilities. Somebody who may find the wording of your web page way too complex. Maybe it is too complex. Maybe there's a way you could simplify the words. And then there are motor disabilities and physical disabilities, like Hal was mentioning. Some people may not be able to use a mouse. Maybe they're keyboard-only users, and so you have to consider those. But I'm in no way an expert on disabilities. But as a web developer, those are some of the things I've thought about.
And I'm glad you mentioned that you have people that you work with that you can see them using certain devices, and you get that kind of usability experience with them. But I feel like for a lot of developers, we don't know anybody who uses any assisted devices, so we don't even really know where to start. What type of assisted devices, like, is there like just a list that you could just throw out there that to kind of get us started on learning about those?
Well, I'm glad you brought up assistive technology. Sometimes we should just say AT as a shortened abbreviation for assistive technology. So there's all kinds of AT out there, but the one I really enjoy using is a screen reader. So if you're on a Mac, there's a screen reader built into OS 10 called VoiceOver, and if you just press Command F5 while you're either viewing a web page in, say, Safari, or even just operating an application on the desktop, the screen reader will open. And the first thing it will do is it will ask you if you need training on how to use that screen reader. So it's actually quite good. And also on mobile, on the iPhone, there's the same screen reader VoiceOver is available. The way you interact with that screen reader is very different. You can use finger gestures instead of using the keyboard. So it's really fun to start experimenting with.
Hold on, we've lost interpreters.
Oh, sorry about that. We'll.
Okay, we've lost.
I'm putting the screen back on the interpreters here. All right.
So there are also free screen readers for Windows. There's one called NVDA. You can get a demo of a commercial product called JAWS, which is probably the most popular screen reader out there. And then on Linux, I do believe that there's some free screen readers as well. So I always suggest that people start learning how to use a screen reader before they start learning best practices for markup, because what really matters in the end is, is this web page accessible? And for people with low vision or no vision, how do they interact with this page in a real sense? And then you can go to the best practices and think, okay, how do I achieve that goal?
Cool. So your suggestion is basically for the developer who is new to accessibility, a good entry point is just to press Command F5 on their MacBook and just start following along and see if they can browse their own website with it, right? Sure.
And of course you can Google some blog posts and other help pages to help you along. But I think that's that's where the geek factor comes out, right? We love playing with cool technology. So look at the screen readers, or there's other assistive technology like Jason was mentioning, where he can zoom in on a piece of text, right, or a part of the screen. Start doing that. Even use that in your own presentations. Like I've often seen people use built-in accessibility features for some other purpose, like doing presentations. So play with the screen reader, play with Zoom text, and there's other assistive technology. There's Braille readers that can go underneath the screen. These are hardware devices, so probably harder to find. But start playing with the assistive technology that's built into the browser, the new HTML5 text tracks. Play with the markup. Learn how you can manipulate text tracks using JavaScript, and see what happens. So there's a lot of fun things to do. Start there with the technology rather than going to some long list of best practices, because I think you'll get frustrated and bored when you see like how many things you have to consider. I think it's more fun to go to the end result and see what happens with assistive technology first.
That's great advice. I feel like we could just end it right there and say, okay, let's just go and start working on it, because there's so much more to talk about. But I do want to kind of go down the path of talking about some of these specific things that you had mentioned before the show, and one of those things was semantic HTML. And so, what is that, and how do we use semantic HTML to make things more accessible?
Well, I think Hal kind of alluded to this earlier, but I think a lot of us have a sense of what semantic HTML is. I probably have trouble defining it, but we think about HTML tags actually connoting what they do, right? So instead of like having div soup, we have now HTML5 tags that are more indicative of their function. So we've all learned that we should use semantic HTML, but when you start really thinking about how that semantic HTML helps with accessibility, then you start saying, oh, there's a lot of there are real repercussions for using the right tags at the right place. Imagine you have a select box, and instead of using the native select, you're going to build your own JavaScript thing, and you're going to make it really cool. You can style it in the way you want, but then you don't go and you don't make that extra effort to make it keyboard accessible. So somebody who's using a screen reader and has to manipulate that text box with the keyboard, they just can't access. They can't access that. And so that person, the developer, didn't realize that if they just used the native select box, it was accessible right away. They didn't have to put any extra effort into it. And so you learn that using semantic markup is really important. And as we talked about earlier, it helps with search engine results. So yeah, semantic HTML really matters, I think. And using assistive technology will help realize that.
So speaking of the HTML, like maybe I think this is an HTML5 feature. You see these little attributes, the ARIA, A-R-I-A. What is ARIA? I don't know if Hal wants to take that one. And what makes it accessible? Using ARIA tags or attributes rather.
How you want me to take that one, or you want to?
You got it, Chris.
Okay, so we talk about, or the earlier question was about semantic markup, and right now we have a lot of tags to do things like select boxes, input boxes, and we hope that the browser has made those accessible out of the box. But now we're dealing with the rub of dynamic content, Web 2.0, a lot of AJAX. Things are changing on the page without a page refresh. And that is a big problem for accessibility because it breaks the model of how a lot of these, say, screen readers work. Something changes on the page, and the person using the screen reader can't see the screen, doesn't know what's changed. And so the new ARIA spec, I think it stands for Accessible Rich Internet Applications, describes some markup that help with these dynamic web pages that we're all building. So they have something called a live region. So if you're going to dynamically change something on the page, you might announce that change to the screen reader program, something that's changed. And not only that, you might say, well, don't interrupt. You might, in the attributes, you might have a property that says don't interrupt the screen reader if they're reading something. Or you might say, be rude and interrupt them because this change is important. So there's all kinds of new standards in this ARIA spec that can help with kind of the newer applications we're writing, and that's ARIA.
Cool. Well, speaking of ARIA, you see a lot of ARIA tags in Bootstrap, the front-end sort of like framework that a lot of people use to start off with, and there's a lot of screen reader indications and things in there. Would you say that Bootstrap is sort of accessible out of the box, or is it? What are some of the problems that pop up with using Twitter Bootstrap and just thinking, oh, it's accessible, right?
Well, I haven't used Bootstrap in a fairly long time, and the first time I looked at it, I thought, well, it looks like they're going in the right direction, but it's still lacking. So they may have made some real strides, but I think that whenever some framework or some UI kit is claiming accessibility, you have to take it with a grain of salt because you really need to do usability testing. Just putting in the right markup, only solves the problem half the time. So I think it's using a framework that says it's accessible is only half the work you have to do. I mean, that's the goal, right? That's the holy grail. I mean, if we could everything we just plug and play and it was accessible, but I don't think we're ever going to get there. So a developer has to be educated about how accessibility can be improved with their own markup.
Yeah, and you said that the holy grail was that the usability testing, and a lot of times that's something that you try to do, and when you're not trying to do web accessibility specifically, but usability testing just turns your website into something amazing just by doing a few tests. So I can only imagine the benefit that you get when you try to add in accessibility on top of that, just making just a really amazing web product. So I feel like that's a tool that we should all play with as responsible web developers, is to try to make something that's just really, really valuable to the world.
Absolutely.
So if I'm just getting into accessibility as a new web developer, or as a developer like me who's been doing it for a long time but doesn't know a whole lot about web accessibility, what are some of the accessibility gotchas that we might run into from time to time? Or it might be hang-ups or snags when we first start getting into it?
I think, I had to learn the hard way about pitfalls in accessibility, and I think, I studied it pretty intensely for a couple months. I read a bunch of blog posts, and I mistakenly thought that, okay, I've read a couple blog posts. I've read some books on the subject. I've put in the right tags. I'm pretty darn good. But once we had an audit of our web pages by a professional accessibility team, I noticed that I had a lot to learn. For example, I had learned that you put in headings, and that's really wonderful for your web page. And so I just littered my pages with tons and tons of headings. Like just in the footer alone, I had like all the way down to heading level 6. Heading level 1 down 6. And I said, okay, what I didn't understand is that actually hurt the usability of my web pages. That there's diminishing returns about how many headings you put in there. It's like, imagine you're reading a book, and then on every page there is a heading of 10 headings for every page. It's just like it was too much, and it's better to have somebody tell me during usability testing, hey, let's try to keep this to say 5 or 6 really useful headings. So when I jump around the page, or I'm scanning the page, I have a good sense of what it's about without spending a lot of time. So I think some humility is helpful. I learn that, hey, none of us are going to be 100% accessible. There's always ways to improve, and so it's always a good continuum. Like a lot of directors, bosses, they say, oh, make this accessible, and I want a stamp of accessibility on there. You can't guarantee that. All you can do is make your best efforts, and then go to real users and get feedback about where you can improve.
So since you're saying it's not quite as black and white as like, okay, now it's accessible, checkbox, it's more of a gradient, it sounds like.
Yeah, no, it is. And I think that there are, one of my big pet peeves are these automated accessibility checkers. It's a big thing at universities too, because universities they're often taking federal money. So whether they're public or even private universities taking federal money, they're on the hook. They need to be accessible, or they could be sued. So no, it's the right thing to do, but there are legal obligations. And so I'm sorry, I got off track here, but what was the
Well, I was curious about like like if you say it's just accessible enough, like you can't just like stamp it and say like, oh yeah, it's definitely 100% accessible.
Oh, yeah. Right. So the problem is that we are on a legal obligation, so we want to know that we're accessible when I click that checkbox, right? And so we want to run these automated tests, and they think, well, if the boss sees that I ran these automated tests and they all pass, then we must be accessible. But for example, alt text and image, you could put some garbage text into an alt text, and it would pass the automated test, but you're not accessible from a usability point of view. And so, I really think that we're often doing a disservice when we rely solely on automated tests as a measure of accessibility. We really need to test with real users. And not only do you find things you can improve, but you might find out that, hey, I didn't need to spend so much time on, you know, adding maybe table captions or whatever it is. So, you know, testing with real users is great. I realize it's hard to find access to folks, but that's what really helps.
Right. So how do you work with trying to get the sites at the university rated by any sort of official organization that kind of takes that that gradient of like how accessible something is and give it some sort of rating so you can have something finite to show somebody?
We don't have like a rating system, but maybe Chris can say more about this. But I think the National Federation of the Blind has some kind of certificate where you can submit to the organization, and they can evaluate your page and say, like, to us, this is accessible enough. But that's pretty much it. But most of the time, we just, you know, test it ourselves or ask a student with disabilities to test the site for us.
So I guess we mentioned something about WCAG. It's WCAG, and it's some sort of, you mentioned it was like a rating system, I guess, for the government. Is that right? Or?
Oh, right. Yes. So WCAG. So a lot of times now we talk about WCAG 2.0. So it's more of just a list of specifications where you can check your site against, and that's actually what a lot of these automated testing tools are built off of. So they're testing these like spec criteria items against your site. So a lot of times we strive for level AA. So there are 3 levels to WCAG 2.0. There is just A, and there's AA, and there's AAA. So AAA is the hardest level to obtain, and you have to do a lot of things to your site to make it AAA standard.
Gotcha. And in the same sort of breath, when we were discussing this before the show, is you mentioned poor, or I don't know if that was you or Chris who mentioned poor, P-O-U-R, and asking if your website's poor. So what does that mean when you ask if your website is poor?
Yeah, so Chris can talk about that.
Oh, can I? I think it's nice because as developers we always ask, oh, is my code dry, or things like that. So it's kind of nice to ask yourself, is my web page poor? And you know, those are laid out in the WCAG guidelines, as Hal was mentioning, and the P stands for perceivable. Like, you know, is this widget even perceivable by somebody, say, using a screen reader, or say somebody's using zoom text, right? And they're zoomed in, but if your widget is so spread out that half of the widget is no longer viewable in the screen when somebody's zoomed in, and maybe that's not perceivable. So that's the P part. Next part is O, which is operable. So maybe somebody can see your widget, right, and they know that that's important for them to say add something to their shopping cart. But if they can't operate it, right, there's a submit button there, but you know, maybe it's not used semantic markup. They had a div make the submit button, and now when somebody's pressing the space bar, which normally would you know, evoke that click handler, now it no longer works. So now it's not operable, for example. Another part is the understandable, understandable. So you know, people have to understand how they get from place to place, or understand how they're operating with this widget. Say you have a drop-down menu, and you know, it is keyboard accessible, but you've come up with your own convoluted rules about keyboard shortcuts. You haven't followed any conventions that already exist for keyboard navigation, so that, you know, it's not understandable. And then the final part is the R, the robust. So you know, when we develop web pages, we're always checking with say older versions of IE, right? You know, so we're making, in that sense, we already understand we have to make our web pages robust so that they're not only working with, you know, the latest, greatest versions of web browsers. They have to somehow reach the mass of the people who may not be using the latest version of IE. So in that sense, it has to be robust. It has to support various screen readers in various combinations. And just as you would make a grade A matrix for your you know, browser support, you would also do that for, say, you know, screen readers and the Zoom text and all that.
Cool. So speaking of all the sort of official levels and you know, whatever the rating system is that you're using, those are something important to kind of show the government, right? When you you guys mentioned earlier, if you don't have certain things implemented, then you could possibly get sued. What kind of websites are in that category of being governed by, like in this case, the U.S. government?
You know, I'm not an expert on that. How, or anybody else, please interrupt me if you want to speak to that. But in the work that we do, if it's a public accommodation, like if our websites are meant for, you know, a larger public, then they have to be accessible. If they're not a public accommodation, as Hal was mentioning, maybe we just have a staff. Maybe a group of a dozen people who are using this, and it's for our own personal use, then, you know, maybe we can say, okay, we're not going to spend time to make that accessible. We'll work that in later, but at first release, we're not going to do that. But if something we're using, like our, you know, online courses, I mean, if these are public accommodations, then they have to be accessible.
Gotcha. Well, and that's in the U.S. So I noticed there was a law passed in Canada not too long ago, a couple years ago actually, that was starting to mandate accessibility standards for websites, not just government websites, but also businesses from large to small. And I feel like I think if I understand correctly, that law, the final law or the final phase of that law passed to where even small businesses have a certain amount of requirement for having some sort of accessibility for their site. Do you guys know much about the Canadian accessibility laws?
No, I really don't, but I think, as Hal said, it seems like a lot of countries around the world try to align themselves with WCAG level AA. And I know that there's soon new guidelines being put out there, but I would say by and large, a lot of the countries look to those guidelines as a way to you know, formulate their laws. What's interesting is a lot of these laws say that you have to be accessible, but they don't spell out what that means really. You know, technology is changing fast, and just like as web technology, web browsers changing fast, so is assistive technology.
Right.
So
Yeah.
law is purposely vague.
I think a lot of countries, they do follow the US's ADA law. ADA stands for Americans with Disabilities Act. And I think recently, I think maybe 2010, the US also added more to the ADA, which set certain guidelines for like multimedia presentations online. So I think a lot of countries do try to follow what is already in place in the US.
So going forward, just kind of looking at this accessibility issue kind of in broad terms, I want to ask Jason specifically, what would be your advice for a web developer to take the perspective of your situation and getting started with accessibility? What advice would you give a developer? Oops, I'm sorry, I have to unmute the interpreters. Interpreters, would you mind unmuting yourself? I don't have that ability. There we go. Now we can hear Jason.
Sure. With what Chris and Hal said, playing with the design or the developer tools.
And just various things that you could read on the internet. It's basically, it's a great how-to guide. You know, it's how to navigate around the web. You know, I mean, the internet itself, it's very contextual. So really, I mean, it's easy to use. It's really easy to use. I'm sorry. Video skipping a little bit. Again, please. Sorry. So just going back, did you miss the, no, talking about new developer, just again, sorry. We'll give Sammy something to edit. A lot of times too, it's like you have to look at how you're navigating and look at the background color and how it contrasts against the main color. Is it possible? Is it possible to look at the usability standards from that perspective? For example, you can really play with it in developer tools. Just use your imagination and look at it from the perspective of someone who might be low vision. Think of those color contrasts. Imagine yourself. I mean, how would you see it? How would it feel? How would you solve that issue if you had limited vision, or okay, so for example, say you're deaf. Or
what is that? Sound effects.
Oh, so I'm sorry, interpreter mistake. So say like sound effects. I mean, if you have certain things like that in the page, like how would a normal person view it? Would they enjoy it? For example, like call waiting music, things like that. Sometimes people might use sound effects on the web or music on the web, and for a deaf person, it's not really, it's not natural just to sit around and wait for something. So there's no indication. It's nothing to really sit around and wait for and enjoy it. So maybe have some kind of text description of what's happening there. You got to look at that look and feel. Like put yourself in the deaf person's shoes and really analyze that look and feel.
That's some really great advice, and I guess it ultimately just comes down to just trying to experience that usability testing, with somebody who's using assisted devices and things. So that's great advice. Thanks for that, Jason. And Andy, do you have any final thoughts as we start to wrap it up here?
Well, I was thinking. Related to the recent comments, it's like we have to really take a look at someone else's perspective. Which experience is better? I mean, I'll take it.
Someone who's deaf or someone who's blind might have different experiences. And another thought, really, it's I'm thinking, well, it could be good to set up accessibility and standards that have everything that are equal.
So set up a standardization for accessibility.
And that's a very important challenge and a formidable goal.
True that. And actually, I have one more question for you, Andy. Do you have any accessibility aids that you use when you're programming, like in your IDE or anything like that, or is it pretty straightforward? You don't need anything else.
Let me see. I'm looking at my notes here. In the past, well, not like what assistive technologies blind people might use, but I set up specific colors, for that visual, so that I don't get visually overwhelmed, so I can focus on what I'm looking at, and I can focus on everything from a neutral perspective. So that's that's really what I focus on when I'm coding. And really I do that because deaf people see everything and are easily distracted. You know, if the lights overhead aren't right, you know, it becomes difficult to focus. So having all sorts of colors is really visual noise to us. We don't like that. You know, and really it's important to quiet all the extra noise and all of the other distractions so I can focus on what it is that I'm working on. That's just my perspective. You know, maybe more than some other hearing developers might use, or, you know, hearing developers might not be bothered by those types of things. And if information happens to show up, or, you know, if there are comments or things to focus on, that's really the important part.
That's some good advice to follow even for people who aren't needing accessibility things, but to just, as a programmer, to just try to focus as much as you can on the thing that you're trying to focus on, right? Just kind of eliminate all the distractions. I think that's just some good advice in general. So I'm inspired. I'll try to like trim down my IDE so I don't have all the distractions. So, Chris and Hal, do you guys have any final thoughts on accessibility or tips for us guys trying to get involved?
You know, one thing is that you know, accessibility is the responsibility of everybody. And as a developer, we can only do so much with our markup and our scripts and our code. We need to have buy-in, obviously, from management. Sometimes when it's a top-down mandate, things get done. Trying to do things from the grassroots up, you always hit a wall at some point. Things will take too long. It's too expensive. But you need your content providers to be thinking about accessibility. You know, providing the right content. You know, going into your content management system and using headings and actual semantic links and all that kind of thing. But you also need buy-in from your designers. You know, the color contrast and you know, font size and stuff like that. So you know, you focus on what you can, but a lot of your responsibility too is teaching other people about accessibility and getting their buy-in. And that's not easy, but I think one of the most effective ways is to you know, bring in experts who are really affected by these issues and have them give a demo of it. And that kind of thing, that kind of demonstration has such an impact, so much more than I could as an individual developer telling people, you know, best practices.
Cool.
Yeah, I think for me, you know, tonight we talked a lot about, you know, like compliancy and standards. I think as web developers, we should just like have fun, right? Like we should treat the assistive technology, like screen readers, as a toy and just play with it. You know, learn some shortcuts with the screen reader and navigate a page with your screen off, right? And there are plenty of resources online for you to learn about web accessibility. But one caution is don't get too crazy with it. I mean, like Chris said, it's easy to kind of get lost in the world of web accessibility and learn like a lot of new things, and then start like peppering heading tags on your page, right? But I think we should always go back to the screen reader and assistive technology and just test your page as you develop them.
Yeah, Hal, you should mention your idea about how that relates to the cargo cult.
Yeah, so Chris knows that I love talking about cargo cult. So the cargo cult idea is we do something without knowing why we do it, right? Like in programming, a lot of times we do that. Like we would just copy a snippet of code from somewhere else because we know like, oh, that works, and we paste into our own code without thinking about, you know, security or performance implications. And same thing with web accessibility. A lot of times we see like one post on like figure tag is accessible, right? Then we're like, oh, let me just put all figure tags whenever I need an image. And that's not the way to go, right? Because maybe, figure tag itself obviously has its own special purpose apart from the like image tag. But even when you're using assistive technology like a screen reader on a page that you're building with figure tags, it might not work. So always test your page.
True that. Good advice. So usually at this point, I announce to everybody who's watching live that I'll be posting the Google Hangout link, and we'd love for you to join the conversation. And I would love to do that for this episode, except that there's a limitation with the number of people you can invite, and we're pretty much maxed out at that point right now. So I'm not going to be doing this post show with the viewers, but we will for the next episode, which happens to be in a live recording. I'm going to get to that in a second because I wanted to do the developer shout-out, just like we're starting to do for every show. In this segment, recognizes a developer who has contributed a lot to the PHP community or the open source world or web development world or something like that, and gives them a big shout-out for their contributions. And the developer is nominated by the panel before the show. So for this episode, I asked the panel to nominate a developer who has contributed significantly to making the web more accessible. So the developer shout-out for episode 11 of the PHP Roundtable goes to Jared Smith of WebAIM. So congrats, Jared. Chris, do you mind telling us a bit more about this guy Jared, why he was nominated for the developer shout-out?
Well, I think if you just starting off with web accessibility and you do some searching, you'll immediately find a website called WebAIM. And there they have some great tips, and they help you understand the WCAG guidelines, and they also give some practical advice about what screen readers are popular now, what combinations of assistive technology and browsers are best, and so it's a place to really get started, but it's also a place to get into more advanced topics if you want to. And what Jared Smith does is not only contribute to this this website, but he also goes around giving great inspirational talks. And he really knows the issues that developers face. And so in terms of just getting the word out, he has done an incredible job and continues to do a great job.
Awesome. Well, it sounds like a well-deserved nomination. So, Jared, if you're watching, I'll be sending you this small token of our appreciation on behalf of the PHP Roundtable and all the people here at the panel. This is a $15 Amazon gift, or I'm sorry, iTunes gift card. That is an iTunes logo, not an Amazon logo. And so I'll be hitting you up on Twitter and trying to get that mailed out to you through snail mail. And just to wrap things up, I'd like to give all the guests at the roundtable an opportunity to shamelessly plug something. So let's go around real quick. Chris, you got anything you would like to shamelessly plug?
With Hal, we're co-organizers of the Laravel meetup in Chicago. Mention anybody to go there. But also, what I want to mention is the website. If you go to, let's see the website, accessibilityassociation.org. Website's the International Association of Accessibility Professionals, and this is a group that is starting to get off the ground, but it's a place where you can learn about accessibility, see what kind of events are happening, how you might learn about some certification. Just a place to exchange ideas, and the membership is free right now. So I would recommend up until March you should go to there and sign up for that.
Cool, sweet. How do you got anything that you would like to shamelessly plug?
Sure. So I am giving a talk at PHP Tech in May on ditching jQuery. So I hope people can make that.
You just got the news for that today, that PHP Tech, one of the biggest PHP conferences in the entire world, just said, hey, why don't you come speak for us?
Yep.
It's quite an honor, so congratulations on that, man.
Thank you.
I want to kick it off to, let's say, Jason. Do you have anything that you would like to shamelessly plug?
Yes. I really wanted to talk about an iOS application for low vision people. It's free. And it basically helps anyone with screen reading or anyone that has a low vision. So that's. Oh, it's called Low Vision Center. It's called Low Vision Center, and it's for iOS.
Low Vision Center for iOS. So if I were to search for Low Vision Center on the iTunes store or in the App Store, I would find it?
Yes.
Excellent. Perfect. And finally, we'll toss it over to Andy. Do you have anything for shameless promotion?
Yeah, I want to talk about my own business. You know, we do different things, different type of projects. And someone always tries to, basically anything connected with the web. And here we go. www.techniorchardllc.com.
Awesome. Well, thanks for joining us, guys. I'll be adding those links to the show notes when I finally get that feature implemented on the website. But it's taken me a second. The first priority is to get an RSS feed so I can submit it to iTunes. And finally, James Mallison, who's been bugging me about the RSS feed since day one, will be happy, and I'll be able to pat him on the head and say thanks for being so loyal. Actually, if you guys are going to Sunshine PHP, if you're watching, I will also be there, and we're planning on doing a live recording right in some room, maybe like during a hackathon. I don't know yet, but we'd love to have you there and join the live recording at the at the round table. And if you're a developer who likes to have conversations about topics that PHP nerds care about, then you need to be on this panel. So hit me up on Twitter if you're interested. My Twitter handle is SammyK, or just hit up PHP Roundtable. Always looking for fun things. Or if you have topic ideas, we'd love to just talk about anything that you guys care about, or we can research and just talk about in front of everybody and learn together. So I'd like to thank once again to Hal, Chris, Andy, and Jason for joining this roundtable discussion today. And I'd also like to thank our interpreters, Rich Goodrow and Greg Sperling, who have donated their time to make episode 11 of the PHP Roundtable an accessible one. And finally, they are available, and I have the website pulled up right here. The interpreters are provided from gsterp.com, and I'll provide that link in the show notes as well. So that about does it for this episode, and we'll see you guys in the next one.
Thank you.